He hadn't seen her face in years, but the shape of her presence still lived in the spaces between his breaths, in the silence before sleep, in the dust that rose beneath his feet. Every time he walked alone, the world had moved on. The sun still rose, the herds still wandered. But somewhere deep in the marrow of his bones, he carried a weight with no name, a memory that never unraveled. Time had stretched thin between them, a cruel thread, fraying with distance and silence. But something in him refused to forget, refused to surrender the echo of a touch, the warmth of a gaze. And when the sky turned a certain shade of gold, he would stop without knowing why and listen, as if the past could speak through wind and ache, through absence and longing, through that invisible thread that never truly broke. Each morning began the same way, with the hush of dawn and the rustle of dry grass beneath slow, steady steps. He moved through the sanctuary like a ghost, not wild, not tame, existing in the in-between. The caretakers called him by name Tembo, but he rarely responded, not out of defiance, but as if the name no longer belonged to him. He ate when food was placed before him, drank when water came close, but his eyes were always somewhere else, beyond fences, beyond trees, searching for a shape that had long since vanished. He often wandered to the far corner of the enclosure, where the wind came in unfiltered, and stood there motionless, as though listening to something only he could hear others played, splashed, rumbled with the energy of youth. But Tembo remained apart, tracing silent circles in the dirt, pressing his trunk into the ground as if trying to reach something buried beneath time. His days passed in routine, but the stillness was deceptive. Inside him, the ache moved quiet and constant, a rhythm without sound, each habit a ritual, each pause a memory. And though the world saw calm in his slow movements, in his lowered head and quiet steps, grief lived just beneath the surface, patient, enduring, unresolved. It happened without warning. The sky unchanged, the air thick with the scent of dust and sun. But something was wrong. She lay too still, too quiet, her breath gone. Though he waited for it, waited until the waiting became a weight in his chest. He didn't understand, not fully. Only that the warmth beside him had faded, and nothing he did could bring it back. He nudged her, circled her, cried out, but the sound only fell back on him, unanswered, and when the others came closer, he stood guard. Small, trembling, trying to protect what could no longer be saved. The fear came first, a sharp, cold thing, then confusion, and then the worst of all, the absence, a vast, blank silence that swallowed every sound. He knew they pulled him away. In the end, his body too, weak to resist, his heart too broken to try. And as they carried him through the trees, his eyes never left the place where she'd fallen in the days that followed. He stopped making noise, stopped seeking out others. He stood apart, even among the lost, even among the motherless. The other calves nudged him, invited him to play. But Tembo turned inward deeper each day, his body growing heavier, stronger, but his spirit retreating, hidden behind long blinks and long silences. His world shrank to the memory of a voice he could no longer hear and a presence he could no longer feel. The keepers did what they could, but nothing softened the space around him. The days turned into months, the months into years, and still he watched the horizon every evening. Still he waited, as if the wind might someday bring her back, or at least bring an answer to the question that had never been spoken, but had filled him completely. Why did she leave, and why was he still here? Let me pause for just a moment. Where are you, listening to this story from? Have you ever felt that someone, maybe a person, maybe even an animal, remembered you after years apart? That quiet, unspoken recognition that shakes something deep inside. If stories like this touch your heart, hit that follow button. There's so much more ahead, and each one is meant to find the part of you that still believes in connection, no matter how much time has passed. It came unexpectedly, a photo in an email blurred by dust and distance. A young elephant standing apart from the others, head low, eyes empty, but the name beneath it stopped her breath. Tembo. It struck her like a whisper in a room she thought was long, silent, and suddenly everything she'd buried surged forward. The smell of dry grass, the weight of his tiny trunk wrapping around her wrist, the way he used to mimic her footsteps when he thought she wasn't looking. It couldn't be him, she told herself. Logic, warred with longing years, had passed. He would have forgotten. Surely they all had, and yet there was something in his posture, in that distant ache behind his eyes, that looked too familiar to ignore. For hours, she sat staring, torn between the ache of maybe and the fear of no. Her heart whispered, "Go." Her mind warned against disappointment. But somewhere deep, where memories still bloomed, she felt the stir of something older than fear, older than doubt. She knew elephants never forget. But did he? Remember her, did it matter? In the end, it wasn't a decision. It was a surrender. She booked the flight without telling anyone, packed quickly, but carefully, placing an old photo in her bag, just in case she needed to remember what hope used to look like. And as the plane rose into the sky, she closed her eyes and let herself believe, even if only for a moment, that some bonds don't break. They only sleep, waiting for the right wind to wake them again. The air was warm, but still the kind of quiet that presses against the skin and slows time. She stepped into the sanctuary with cautious steps, the soft crunch of gravel beneath her feet barely audible over the pounding in her chest. He was there, standing beneath a wide acacia, his shape larger, his frame heavier, but there was something in the tilt of his head, the gentle sway of his ears that hadn't changed. He hadn't seen her yet, not truly, not until the wind shifted, carrying her scent across the field. And he froze, not with fear, but with something older than instinct. He turned slowly, his eyes finding hers across the distance, not blinking, not moving, and in that held breath something cracked, not loudly but deeply, as if the ground beneath both of them exhaled. His ears twitched, his trunk lifted, partway, then dropped again, uncertain, searching, and then she said it, barely a whisper. His name, Tembo, and the sound hung there suspended between them. A name no one else had spoken like that the way she used to, and it was as if the years collapsed all. At once, his body responded, before he could think, before doubt could silence memory. He took a step, then another. Then he was moving faster, still unsure, but pulled by something he could not resist, and she met him halfway. Tears already on her face, arms outstretched, though she knew he didn't need them, not really, and yet he pressed into her chest gently. First, then completely, a low thunder rolled from deep inside him, a sound not heard in years. And it was not just a sound, it was memory and mourning and a kind of joy too big for words. Her hands trembled as she touched his forehead, as if she feared he might vanish if she moved too quickly, but he stayed, eyes closed, breath warm against her shoulder, and in that moment the silence between them broke not with noise, but with knowing, and the space where absence had lived was filled again. Not perfectly, not completely, but undeniably something lost had found its way back, and neither of them would ever be the same. At first, it was barely noticeable, a slow, soft shift like the earth warming after rain. Tembo began to reach out, not far, not often, but enough, a gentle nudge to the keeper's hand, a playful flick of his trunk at a passing bird, a quiet rumble that trembled through the ground when Lila came near. She would sit beside him, not speaking, just breathing beside his silence, until one day he pressed his forehead lightly against her shoulder. Not in grief, but in something quieter, acceptance. And the next morning, he greeted her first before the food, before the others, with a sound so low it felt like a secret. Only they shared, he began to bathe with the others again, splashing not wildly, but with intent, with presence. Lila watched it all, and in the watching, something inside her softened. The ache that had curled in her chest for years began to uncoil. She no longer woke with the same heaviness, because now each morning held purpose, not in the grand gestures, but in the quiet ones, the way he would look for her in the crowd, the way his eyes softened when she laughed, the way he stood just a little taller when she reached out to touch his cheek. Trust was returning, not as a sudden flood, but as light, slowly seeping into the corners that had gone cold, and she too was healing. Not because the pain had vanished, but because she no longer carried it alone. They didn't speak of the years they lost, but every step they took together was a sentence written in a language that didn't need words. The past still lived within them, but it no longer weighed them down. It walked beside them, a reminder not of what was broken, but of what endured. And as the sun dipped low and the wind curled around them, Tembo brushed his trunk gently against her arm, and she closed her eyes and smiled, because sometimes the quietest moments are the ones that mean the most, and sometimes love doesn't return with thunder. It returns with presence and stays with grace. Some bonds don't need to be spoken to be understood. They survive in the spaces between years, in the pauses between heartbeats. They bend under time, but never break. They wait patiently beneath silence, beneath sorrow, waiting for the right moment to rise again. And when they do not ask questions. They simply return, whole, quiet, unshaken. What Tembo and Lila found was not what they lost, but what remained, the part of love that endures not in memory, but in presence, not in noise, but in knowing and in finding each other again. They found themselves healed, not all at once, not completely, but enough, and sometimes enough is everything.